All right. This morning, I'm going to try to make a little bit of light, but it was turning into a more grim subject as the days wane on. Uh, Conspiracy theories and the recent release, the newest release of these Epstein files. Uh, when I was a kid, um, there was this newspaper. It was made of paper and it claimed to be news. Um, as you would leave the store right at kids' eye level, too, when I think about it, right along with all the various magazines like the Inquirer and People and all that other stuff. That's just like your last minute thing to grab was a thing called the Weekly World News. And the Weekly World News would tell these fantastical tales in a format that was like a newspaper. It would have an article about some subject and it would, cite a source, some sort of expert that was talking about these subjects. And they were always extremely outlandish. Now, of course, as a kid, you don't know much better. And kind of like Santa Claus, your parents indulge you, with that sort of thing. Mom, I want to get this, okay, fine. And actually, it's funny. My mom actually enjoyed that stuff too. It's just kind of fun because one of the things I did inherit from her is her love for any kind of, mystery that has, a lot of holes in it. And so you can fill in the gaps with some fun stuff, I don't know, it depends on how seriously you take this stuff. But, this magazine would always do things like, it would tie an existing mystery in together with some ancient mystery. A lot of the times it'd be like, the Bermuda Triangle, right? We know that the Bermuda Triangle, which is a highly trafficked area of the ocean heading towards the Caribbean Sea. And for some reason or another, instrumentation goes wacky there and weather gets weird and stuff like that. Whatever, some sort of situation there that causes, electronics to freak out from time to time. And the Bermuda Triangle itself spawns off some interesting tales of people who, say that they've seen other worlds or there were aliens or whatever. And who knows, right? Who knows? But it's always been something of a mystery. And this magazine on the front would always boldly proclaim like Atlantis found in the Bermuda Triangle, and so you'd open this newspaper and some expert would be talking about, yeah, we found all these ancient ruins and that explains all the electromagnetic flaws that happen in, vehicles above the sea, and they'd have maybe some drawn picture or some, fairly well drawn, and, they kind of looked like photos sometimes. Bat Boy, that was the big one. The Bat Boy was found in a cave, and it's this this monstrous baby with sharp teeth and pointed ears, but that stuff was always really tickled my fancy because mysteries have always tickled my fancy. And just in general, I always like the idea that the world is just bigger than what we think. There were cartoons. There was a cartoon I loved, man, when I was a kid. It was called The Mysterious Cities of Gold. And the plot was about a conquistador in the 1500s or 1600s or whatever, looking for El Dorado. And in their quest, it had this man that was kind of the mentor of the group, and then these three kids and their pet bird and stuff, and they're running around the jungles and avoiding natives and finding secret ruins and avoiding traps and all this stuff. And they find this magical device from the ancient world before the Ice Age called the Iron Condor, and it was this, or Golden Condors, the Golden Condor. They fly around in this ship. The premise being that, there was a mysterious Atlantean civilization that existed far before human history, and they were finding the remains of this place, through the clues that were left behind. That sort of stuff is always really fascinating me. And part of it informs why I play a lot of video games and Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. And there's a lot of unexplained stuff in the world that when you start scratching at the surface, our contemporary modern pseudo historical scientific explanations can't really put our heads around. The Nazca lines. They made these massive images of birds and stuff out in the desert in South America that don't look like anything from the ground. It's only from the sky that you can see what they've made. Now, were they smart enough as engineers to make these pictures without knowing what they were looking at? Probably. I mean, that seems reasonable. Who are they trying to send that image to? Who did they think was the recipient? Probably the gods, aliens. Or again in South America, you have all these pieces of ancient construction far before any kind of machinery, where the lines between the seams between the blocks are so precise that you can't today put a piece of paper in between them, and nothing really exists like that in the world. The pyramids always tickle people's fancy. How did they build these massive things? Now, of course, the pyramids feel pretty simple to me. The Nile, it just creates an overabundance of food. It's a calorie surplus equation is what the pyramids look like to me. We got all this food, we got all these people, we cut and push rocks. They did have clever engineering techniques, I'm sure. When you're doing that stuff for 40 years or whatever, you'll probably come up with some pretty interesting ideas as you're trying to solve this massive problem. But there are all sorts of things like that throughout the world. And then we, of course, have our various legends and biblical tales and religious scripts and all these other things that talk about these fantastical ideas that really want us to believe. Atlantis is another one that I really like. Plato mentions this civilization that was very advanced, that was out beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, which we know it's beyond the Straits of Gibraltar now. In that world, in his world, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar was the great unknown. You went out there, who knows what's out there, right? Now, of course, you could go up into Europe and you could go down into Africa. And most recently, for this one, I found a kind of fun theory that would explain what he was talking about, called the Reichert structure, which is this strange formation, geological formation in the middle of Mauritania in the desert. And it could have had water in it, and it would explain the geography that he's describing in those works of this city of the future, essentially, that he's describing, that could explain those stories, right? Or is it the Canary Islands? Or is it some island that blew up in the middle of the Atlantic that we just have never found evidence? Who knows? But that's the fun part, is who knows? You'll never really know the answer, so it's fun to explore these things. But there's other stuff that happens in a more modern context that is a little more, it's more about pattern recognition, right? It's a little more about realizing that the story doesn't add up. And the big one, of course, that was in people's heads when I was growing up was the John F. Kennedy assassination. Now, high level, John Kennedy was the president of the United States. There were a number of rather controversial things he was doing around the time he was assassinated. He was going after the Federal Reserve. He was running afoul of what they called the white nobility, who were dispossessed Russians that really wanted to overthrow the communist government and get their stuff back in the Soviet Union. The height of the Cold War was going on, and the Kennedys themselves had bad blood with other families from, their own personal history back into the 20s and stuff, in the bootlegging days. I mean, when you look back at a lot of, just in general, a lot of history of these, powerful families, there's usually some illicit trade they were involved in some form or another that helped them on their rise to power. And, that's no grand conspiracy. So, they bootlegged alcohol. Yeah, a lot of people did. Some people didn't get crazy rich, but, it's not unreasonable to say, okay, that's what happened, right? Even if the families themselves deny it, or they try to sweep that stuff under the rug. But when Kennedy was assassinated, the TV cameras didn't get a very good angle of it, and everything happened so fast, and the whole lead up to the whole situation was very strange. He was riding around in a convertible car with not very good guards protection. He'd been scheduled kind of last minute into this place, and this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, according to the official report, was the only person that shot him from the window of a library that was across the street with sniper precision, and basically just annihilated this guy's head in front of the crowd. And it was one of those things. Kennedy assassination was one of those things where people, that whole generation, would say, "Where were you when you heard about Kennedy?" Right? My mom said that she was in her classroom and she heard about it. The teacher had heard about it and she started to cry. Kennedy had a real power of a cult of personality. He was very charismatic. The ladies loved him, as we know. Also not a grand conspiracy. Marilyn Monroe and all that stuff. And we don't know all the details, but we know for sure that there was some stuff going on there between her and him and everything else. But, at the end of the day, so what? It's salacious, but it's not that big of a deal, except for the blackmail element, when a president is doing stuff like that. But one of the things that happened as in the wake of this massive national tragedy that was just all what people were talking about for days and weeks. For us, it was 9/11 for my generation, and the kids that are younger than us who didn't live through that, they don't understand that because they haven't gone through it. And I hope you never do, whatever the next crazy thing is. But it's all anyone would talk about, and it freaked everyone out. Because again, this was the height of the Cold War, like straight up the height of the Cold War. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis not long before, where I think we got to DEFCON 2 or something. We were very close. And Kennedy himself talked everybody down because he had an excellent point about Russians putting nukes on Cuba. That's not far from the continental United States, and we couldn't have that. But he also wanted to let everybody know that this isn't about hurting the Cuban people. This is just about the military, and it's just about our national interests in trying to stay in an equitable position during this escalating scenario of mutually assured destruction. It was a thorny, tough issue, the Cold War. And I really, there were numerous incidences where cooler heads prevailed, where had they made other decisions, none of us would probably be here today, right? Or we'd be in a very, very different world. But Kennedy was shot in such a manner, and that it gave people pause, like, okay, what was happening that day? What is the lead up to this? How did he end up in this situation? People want explanations. They want to understand pattern recognition, both because they want to know what happened, and how do we prevent such a horrible thing from happening in the future, right? And one of the interesting aspects of the Kennedy assassination is there was a private film, and I can't remember his name. It's like Abraham's something, I forget, but his last name was Zapruder, and they call it the Zapruder film. And he had one of those 60 millimeter film cameras, so it's silent, I do believe. I don't think it has any audio, but he's recording this thing on his new cool device, right? He's like, wow, hey, check it out. It's the president of the United States. Oh my God, But so when he had this film and he had it developed, and he saw that he had all this stuff, and he turned it right away over to the media because he trusted the media. And to some extent, you could say that the media was fairly trustworthy, relatively speaking. Turned this stuff over to them. Said, yeah, I got it on film. And so this new set of film that was not part of the regular dialogue came out, and people started to analyze this thing. They found all sorts of weird stuff. Who's this guy with the umbrella? Why does he even have an umbrella? Why is he shaking it around? They start looking at the crowds to see what's going on, and things get really weird real fast. Like, who is this person, and why are they acting this way, and what's going on over here, and what's this shadow? And that's where you get the whole idea of the grassy knoll and the second shooter and stuff like that. But of course, this film was, it was the quality of the day, consumer grade, no less. So it left a lot of more questions than it did answers. So, of course, people demanded answers, just like they did after 9/11, and the government was real shady about their response, just like they were with 9/11. In fact, 9/11, they did not actually put together a commission to do an investigation on what happened until the families of those who had died insisted on that happening. It took almost a year before they squeezed the arms of Congress to get some sort of thing done, and they did not put much money behind it. So right there in and of itself makes you wonder, why isn't this a priority to our government when this is the most major thing on people's minds all across the world? You'd think that they'd want to get to the bottom of it, wouldn't you? But instead, at 9/11, they shut everything down, got in there to those towers and grabbed all that debris and put them on boats and sent it away to China or wherever to dispose of as fast as they could, and then try to rebuild that area. That was a crime scene, a major one. But they really didn't treat it like one. They wanted to clean that up as fast as possible. And they also were telling people, the air is safe to breathe down here. Well, they knew better. They knew very well what that building was composed of, with lots of asbestos in there. And a lot of the people who were trying to help, the good people who were trying to help people, they were digging through that rubble. They were down there putting out fires and all that stuff. They suffered mesothelioma and were getting sick from it. And they had to also sue the government for just medical care for after what they did, because they were, it was part of their job and all that, vocation and all that. But nevertheless, they were doing their duty, and in contradiction to what the government was telling them, they went out there, in terrible conditions for a human body, because they were being told it was okay, and then they got, terminal illness from it. And the government had to be squeezed to help them out too, right? So the behavior of the government in that scenario gives people pause. And the same with the John Kennedy situation. They didn't really want to talk about it. They didn't really want to talk about it, but they had to, because there were enough people in the United States like, we need to know, man. We need to know what happened. Who did this to the president? Well, it's this random dude, right? Well, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald was captured in the on the run pretty quickly after the assassination, and they take him to a police station, and a mobster named Jack Ruby, while he's being transferred, runs up, just walks right up to him. Nobody stops this guy, shoots him in the stomach, and Oswald dies a few years later. Ruby dies in Alcatraz without ever saying really why he did it. I'm a patriot, is what he said. But Ruby was connected to the mob. And the mob had not as much teeth as they had in the 20s, but they definitely had more teeth than they do now. So people want to know, he's a lone gunman. That was the thing that the government was very insistent on saying. He was a nut job who just wanted to kill people, or wanted to kill the president. And they put together the Warren Commission, which I believe that was the Chief Justice at the time, to do an investigation. And they put together this document that explained how Kennedy was killed by this single lone shooter who was crazy, whack job, right-winger, or whatever his deal was, with no other assistance, no other input, and with one bullet, okay? Now, the magic bullet theory, which basically explained how this bullet just kind of went around a few times or whatever to cause all the damage it did and create all the entry and exit wounds that it did or whatever, was not proposed by a doctor or any kind of anatomist. It was proposed by a lawyer named Arlen Specter. And Arlen Specter went on to become a senator for many, many years. George H.W. Bush was part of the CIA at the time. I think he was the deputy director. He went on to become the president of the United States. And a lot of people who seem to be towing the company line there seem to be getting rewarded for doing so. It's very suspicious. And the Warren Commission's official report that came out was, a 5-year-old wouldn't believe this story. It was absolutely hogwash. No one would believe what the Warren Commission was saying. I encourage you to read it, because this is the kind of thing that the federal government will do. Okay? Based on what we know about John F. Kennedy now, take a look at what the Warren Commission's report says. And know that for 10 years, the federal government stuck by that story. This is the official story. And it became also common lexicon, the term conspiracy theorist. A conspiracy theorist was someone who basically believed that there was more than just Oswald. That there had to be a second shooter. There had to be some network or organization that helped him accomplish the task that he did. It didn't necessarily deny that he was the man that killed Kennedy. There was some people who believed that. But really what they were saying is there's more to this. And conspiracy theorist was actually coined by the government as a way to dismiss this conversation. If you were a conspiracy theorist, you're crazy. We shouldn't even listen to you. You're just out there in left field. Now, one of the ways that they tainted this term, or rather they created this term and created the image of what it is they would include the more wild theories that were used to explain what happened with the more reasonable ones, and muddy the waters and say all of this is conspiracy theories. So if you had people who were like, okay, so this magic bullet theory really doesn't add up. This is just, you're defying physics here. And Oswald was doing things like traveling to Russia during the height of the Cold War, and there were people, he was making calls and stuff like that. There doesn't seem to be enough to explain what the commission's report is versus what we know other facts are. They are not addressing these issues. They conflate those people with the people like, oh, aliens, mind controlled, Oswald, and it was part of a vast, network of ancient, Mayans or whatever crazy thing. They would conflate these two kinds of stories and say, this is all the same stuff. All these people are all crazy. So immediately what would happen in the media is if you said, I don't buy the Warren Commission's report. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Okay, we're not talking to you. And shut those people out of conversation. Well, of course, now this is also an interesting thing. Richard Nixon, by far, is the worst president of the 20th century. He was a horrible human being. I could go on for days about Richard Nixon. But there were some surprising things that he did, because Richard Nixon was not quite part of the old boys club, right? He rose to power out of California at a weird time. So did Ronald Reagan, actually. Although he was a little bit more of he got into the club. But Nixon was never part of it. He was always kind of a crude outsider. And he was absolutely ruthlessly Machiavellian in his clutch for power. Ambitious as hell, this guy. But what that meant, though, is Nixon was afraid of his enemies. And his enemies happened to be the institutional, old money, well-heeled people that had been controlling the government. And I mean this in a true sense, the patricians of the country, the Rockefellers and the Bushes and, all these other folks that just kind of come and go out of Congress and then they go make a bunch of money selling weapons somewhere and then come back to Congress. These people have been around for a long time. Okay? He wasn't one of those guys. It was a conspiracy theory, a wild out there conspiracy theory for a long time. There was a place in California called Bohemian Grove where all these elite people would meet together and perform ritual, demonic rituals or whatever. This was all far out there crazy stuff. until somebody actually snuck a recording out of this event, this yearly event. And it was a gathering kind of like Davos, where they would do this thing where they would burn an owl. No, they would burn an effigy. There was a giant owl statue at this place, and they would burn an effigy. And the ritual was called the burning of care, I believe, or the destruction of care. And what the ritual was about was they were destroying the idea of dull cares. You're here to party, leave your crap at the door or whatever. What it looks like is just a wild, debauched party where the well-heeled people of the country would gather once a year and hobnob with their friends and probably discuss like how they're going to screw everybody else and all that other stuff, despite what they were trying to do with this ritual. But everybody thought this was crazy stuff until it wasn't. So it's actually happening. Was it as salacious as people said? No. Who knows what was going on there, but we do know the basics of it. It was a big party with kind of pagan elements. Certainly didn't look Christian what they were doing, which is what concerned a lot of people because people were much more religious in the day. Nixon was invited to Bohemian Grove at some point in his career, and he did not have positive things to say about it. I will not repeat them here because it's a homophobic statement. But it indicated that he did not click with these people at all. And so as a broken clock is right twice a day, he convened, or he I don't know if he ordered or was insistent on convening the Senate Select Committee on Assassinations to relook into what happened to John Kennedy because he was worried about it happening to him. Now, it's understandable why he thought somebody might want to off him, but he wanted answers. He wanted answers because he didn't know. And I think that's pretty fascinating because we know that when you take over the presidency, you get access to all sorts of information. You ever see what happens when the time between someone has been elected into office and the time that they take office, man, their eyes get sunk. They learn some shit, whatever it is they learn. So he did not know, though, as the president of the United States. And we all know how liberal of a set of rules he thought the president of the United States lived by. But the Senate Select Committee on Assassinations put together at least a little more reasonable story. It's not great. It still has a lot of holes, but at least admits that the Warren Commission's report was baloney. It was absolute garbage. And that garbage is what the government said was the official story for years and years, despite the evidence in front of you, and it would disparage anyone who questioned the official narrative. So, of course, that emboldens people who want to know things like this to say the government is lying to you. That whatever the truth is, that's not it. And it foments a distrust in government. Now, the 70s, especially in the wake of Richard Nixon, there was a lot of distrust in the government, of course. You couldn't believe a word half those guys were saying at any given time, considering Cambodia and Vietnam, Nixon's eventual resignation and the appointment and installation of Gerald Ford, a non-elected official, to become the president of the United States, despite the constitutional framework that tells us what we're supposed to do in these circumstances. All that stuff. The trust in the government was just flushed down the window, or flushed down the drain, rather. Thrown out the window. Flushed out the window, thrown down the drain during the 70s because of all of this repeated stuff that the government was doing. But I could go on and on about conspiracy theories where the government was doing stuff or telling people stuff that was completely false, that we turn around and find out to be completely true or partially true later on down the road. Anywhere from the Tuskegee experiment, where they were giving men syphilis, giving it to them through injections, and then giving them placebos to treat it while they monitored their deleterious progress as the disease withered their bodies slowly away, while lying to them the whole time. This is a fact, my friends. And there's all sorts of other weird experiments that the government has performed on its people. So when you have guys like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. get into office, but he's saying stuff like, fluoride is a neurotoxin. And the reason why it's in our water is because industry couldn't figure out a way to safely dispose of it. So they equated it with the stuff that helps you and just started dumping it in our waterways and saying it's good for your teeth. And it indeed is good for your teeth. It is very bad for your brain. It's linked to Alzheimer's. But if you said that, even if you were a medical doctor, even if you found evidence, over years and years of studies that fluoride is no good for you in that delivery method, nothing wrong with brushing your teeth, just spit it out. But if you keep drinking it, especially if you're close to the source of water supply where they dump it in immediately, that stuff builds up in your system and is ultimately bad for you over a long period of time. Guys like him get elected, or rather appointed. He was running for office, and then he threw his hat in with Donald Trump under the promise that he'd be HHS secretary, and he goes in and starts gutting things because the distrust in the government, when they lie to the people like that, gets so severe that you get other people that are throwing the baby out with the bathwater, potentially, right? Vaccines. Another contentious subject is COVID. But we have to remember that there were very early reports like this is causing heart problems and people are dying, and heart issues was the big one that people were pointing out. But you were a crazy person to talk about that. You're a crazy person to even consider that the vaccine might be something you might want to take some more time on before you deploy it to billions of people. Well, of course, now they have documentation, warnings now on the vaccine that say this can cause heart damage. So they stripped the medical license and absolutely shut people out from the conversation on social media when they were talking about this stuff. And I don't see any apologies. I don't see any grand reinstatement, some grand magnanimous head bowing session like they would maybe do in Japan, where they're like, yeah, we were wrong the whole time. No, what they do is they tell you one thing on page 1 of the newspaper, to use an anachronism now, and then redact it on page 38 8 days later. Oh yeah, that wasn't really true. But the front page is what gets into people's heads, and they operate off of that information. And very few people, the ones that are paying attention, actually catch what's happening on page 38 and say, no, that's not true. But it doesn't matter because everybody else thinks that the first thing that was said was true. And that's how they've adapted and rolled on with their lives. Kennedy being shot by a lone gunman and killed by a patriot mobster was what a lot of people just believed because the government told them so. And they insisted that that was the truth. And that is how they moved on throughout their lives. So we get into the snarly mess that is the Epstein files. Now, I remember reading about Jeffrey Epstein back during 10 years ago now. I can't believe how long ago it is, in the lead up to the 2016 election, which was an absolute disinformation nightmare. Social media was out of control, and all sorts of wild stuff was being said that you could not separate any fact from any fiction, really. And one of the big things that popped up was what they called Pizzagate. Now, Gate, because of Watergate, that's another thing that they do. Anything that is some sort of wild government potential, scandal has the word gate attached to it to almost kind of pull it down from being worthy of investigation, because it's a Watergate was a real scandal that was very salacious and it was a blatant corruption issue. But by putting gate at the end of everything, you can kind of muddy the waters on what this thing is about in the first place. Is it this gate or that gate? Because a lot of times the gates aren't really anything at all. So here comes this Pizzagate thing, right? And essentially what it was a series of documents and emails. And I think it originally really started taking off when Hillary Clinton's emails leaked. Okay. Now this is another interesting piece of that particular bit of history. There was a hacker who went by the name Guccifer that somehow got into and released these email documents. Okay. There was also another release around the same time, and I don't remember the specifics on that one. Although it was associated with a man named Seth Rich, who ended up, he was a DNC worker that a lot of people kind of put the chain of events together, because this man got shot and killed in the streets of DC for a robbery gone wrong, but nothing was taken from him. And enough of the conversation seemed to think that he was the leaker of the DNC email leak. Okay, so you have these two giant email leaks that happened at the same time. The issue for Hillary Clinton was that she was running an email server in a private capacity, and she was using this email server to perform communications off grid. Okay, we keep finding our government officials doing this, by the way. This is not unique behavior to Hillary Clinton. I am not a fan of Hillary Clinton. I will tell you what. That is not because I'm a misogynist. I will underscore that. I think they're fine female politicians and leaders and all that other stuff. I don't like her because she's a warmonger. And she's a politician through and through, just a nasty politician. But what happened is somebody hacked that computer and got all the emails. And we know this because of some Reddit threads where this guy got in and was like, oh God, how do I delete these emails? How do I get this stuff back or whatever? He was freaking out, an administrator talking about this server, and people put two and two together that this was a guy that worked for Hillary Clinton, and he was talking about this server that suddenly all of a sudden all that information got leaked out. And in those emails, there's a lot of strange conversation that doesn't make a lot of sense. They're talking a lot about things like pizza and hot dogs and spending lots of money and hanging out, and they can't wait to have pizza and they can't wait to have pasta and all these other weird, And the thing is there's a lot of people like, you bring in pizza and stuff like that. These are wealthy people. And these words keep coming up. And someone made the connection that this had something to do with child pornography or something, right? Some sort of truly illicit thing, right? Which is a conspiracy in and of itself, right? That's a hell of an accusation. Just jump right to that. But these were code words for something. And so people started to pick it out. And we're like, what could it mean? What could it mean? What could it mean? And the conversation started to settle on the idea that there was some sort of trafficking operation of minors. And there were other series of documents, other things that had gotten out and gotten loose, and they were kind of tying this together and finding this language is being used a lot through these various communications that the elite use. And when I say the elite, the ruling class, some of them, not all of them, but there's definitely a strange set of code words going on. And Jeffrey Epstein was a subject that kept coming up. Now, Jeffrey Epstein was some sort of power broker. We all knew this. And he kept getting in trouble over the years for sex crimes of some sort or another. He was on probation and all this other stuff, doing inappropriate stuff, but he was wealthy, he was well connected. I could go on down the rabbit hole about, Ghislaine Maxwell, she was a moderator on Reddit, the politics subreddit. She was helping correct the narrative before she was arrested. I might add, when I say correct the record was a operation or organization of the Democratic Party that was set up to combat the misinformation that was being distributed online that people were sharing that was related to stuff like this. Ghislaine Maxwell, who was convicted of trafficking minors for sexual purposes from no one to no one. And now she's in a minimum security wing and probably is going to walk sooner or later, right? You put these things together and you realize these people are in charge of us. And Jeffrey Epstein is like this hub in the middle of this giant spoked web of connection related to this seemingly very heinous activity. If you start replacing the code words, which the FBI, I will also, they're documenting right now, that new drop shows their page that basically tells the agent, when you see this word, this is what it means. When you see this word, this is what it means. When you see this word, this is what it means. Hot dog is a young boy. Pizza is a young girl. And I won't go on because it's gross. And these people, if what they're telling their agents, this is, again, fact now. They've given a crib sheet to their agents that when you're working through these documents and you see these words, this is what we've determined those words to mean. So all these people talking about delivering pizza to one another and making sure that the pizza is there and how did you like the pizza? They're talking about something else. This is now established fact. We have to come to terms with that. But back then, this was a wild conspiracy theory to think. Jeffrey Epstein himself, to even suggest that he was somewhere in the middle of all this, was already nut job stuff. You're a conspiracy theorist. You think Bigfoot exists and aliens run the government and there's, secret lizard underground, civilizations or whatever. They conflate all these wild out there stories with people who are trying to make these connections and saying, I think there's something really heinous going on here. I think something really bad is happening. Because if you start thinking of this as a thieves' camp, so to speak, and realize that they're using their own code language to communicate ideas to one another in a way that's under the radar to most people, and you throw these terms that the FBI ended up saying were true onto this stuff, then we got a real problem that we have to address. Why is nobody dealing with it? You know why? Is because the people in power are the ones that are doing it. And for someone like me who loves going down these rabbit holes, who I didn't enjoy that particular rabbit hole, but I did go into it because I wanted to understand, at least at very most, what these people were thinking, some of them, and try to sift out some sort of what is plausible versus what is out of control. And the thing is it's very hard for someone who doesn't even think this way to even try to wrap your mind around what it seems like they were doing. Okay? Now, you have pictures of Bill Clinton with girls that are probably underage, and Bill Gates with girls that are maybe underage. Now, it's still a crime, okay? But I can understand it because they're pretty girls. But that's just the very tip of this iceberg, my friends. And I think it's going to be hard for a lot of people to really wrap their minds around what was happening, what has been happening, and what is continuing to happen as we are ruled by these people, either as masters of titans of industry, or masters of banking, or government officials, or even people we elect ourselves. We choose these people and put them in office. Well, they're chosen for us, then we select them. Now, I didn't know what to make of this stuff. And of course, there's a fierce anti-investigation campaign But most of those things were, oh, that's been debunked. It's been debunked. It's been debunked. Okay, how was it debunked? It's just been debunked. Love that word. Debunked by who? You haven't explained what this means. Why are they spending $60,000 to fly hot dogs in from Chicago? At the very least, I think that's a waste of taxpayer money. I think we should investigate why they're spending that much money to fly custom hot dogs. Actual, Frankenfurters from Chicago into Washington, D.C. I think that's a little wasteful. I think that's a crime in and of itself. I would love it if that's all this was. Barack Obama, again, this is all alleged stuff, but Barack Obama ordering $60,000 worth of hot dogs from Chicago because he loves those Chicago hot dogs. It's like Britney Spears getting her coffee flown on her, private jet from LA to wherever she was. You got to stop that. No, stop it. It's absolutely wasteful. Some dude in a hat comes bringing down the cart down the stairs from Air Force One. Got your Frankenfurters, sir. I'd love it if that's really what happened. I would. That's comical, wasteful. We can't have that, but at least it's something I can enjoy. This is not enjoyable, and the more you read about it, the more you realize how depraved it gets. And I think we're just going to keep uncovering more. We're going to keep piecing together more. The Congress, I don't even know why, to be honest with you. I think it's just because people were getting so pissed at their entire electoral system that they wouldn't release these files. They did not want to address this. So finally, in the late hours of December, we're going to release the files. We order the DOJ to release the files. Have to do it in a month. Way beyond their mandated congressional deadline, which was this weekend. They finally released those files. They told everyone we have to protect the innocent. We have to protect the victims, more accurately. We have to protect the victims. So we got to make sure we go through these documents and make sure the victims' names are removed. Okay. Fair. All the redactions are the people who sent and received these documents. Kids' names are right there. It's not the kids they were protecting. The victims are the people who were performing these acts themselves and committing these transactions. That in and of itself should be enough to just overturn this apple cart, my friends. I don't know what to do about it. These people are out of control, and they run the show. How do we get them out? I don't know. Somebody suggested legislation that blacklists anybody that's found in those files. I hate the idea that some poor person gets swept up in this that had nothing to do with anything. But at the same time, I don't know what else to do. I don't know what else we do to keep these people out of our sphere, out of the sphere of influence for the rest of the country. And we need to prosecute them. Why aren't they being drugged by the necks, dozens at a time, into the prisons and standing in front of judges, getting all sorts of hearings? Why isn't that happening right now? You've been sitting on this stuff for a long time. And the going theory, the Machiavellian theory, is that this is blackmail material. That Epstein was recording all this stuff. So he'd be like, hey, come to my island. It's super fun here. We don't have the rules here like they do in the continental US. You can have some fun here and do whatever depraved thing they want. He's recording it all. And then later on, he's like, you got to vote XYZ or I'm going to turn this loose. Now, a couple of things that are semi-related, but worth mentioning. Kenneth Lay. Kenneth Lay was a friend of George W. Bush, and he was in charge of Enron. Enron was basically playing Russian roulette with the energy markets in California and other places and making a killing. And everyone was paying out the nose for electricity prices because they turned a utility into a financial speculation machine. And they were cooking the books. And they were also paying their auditors to look the other way as they cooked their books. It was a huge scandal. Their auditor was named Arthur Andersen. After the scandal, they rebranded themselves as Accenture. You can escape notice by reinventing yourself when you're a corporation. You don't go to jail as a corporation. You can't, right? But it's like you get a haircut, a dye job, maybe grow a beard or shave. This is the new me. And they continue with their government contracts and all that other stuff. They just continue doing business. Enron, though, their whole company went belly up because of the financial shenanigans they were playing. And all sorts of investors, people who had their life's pension, people who trusted a utility that pays a 30% dividend or whatever they were, it was just a boring thing to invest in, right? When I think of a utility, I think of somebody, a company that's turning oil or whatever into electricity. It's not a pretty thing necessarily, but it's a necessary service. And you can kind of, it's regulated and everything else, but you can kind of figure out pretty easily what the return on it is. It's a very, it should be a very safe investment. So it left pensions and government investments and all sorts of people left holding the bag when this thing blew up. And people were pissed. And Kenneth Lay, one of the very few times a CEO is held criminally liable for the kind of wildness that was happening, was convicted and was going to be sentenced to 20 years. Now, what normally happens to a person when you're convicted of a crime like that and sentenced to 20 years is they haul your ass to jail and you start serving your sentence. But Ken Lay was allowed not only to leave that courtroom, but to leave the state. He went on vacation after his sentencing to Colorado, whereupon he had a heart attack and died. The coroner was a really interesting fellow. I suggest you watch that interview. Yeah, he had a cardiac arrest. And then his body is immediately burned, immediately cremated, while it's in Colorado. They didn't even bring it home. And then when the media was asking the obvious question, this guy's supposed to show up in jail and you're saying he's dead. Can we see the body or something? Stop asking questions. Respect the family, was the answer that the media got. And we looked the other way. Now, I don't know for sure. I can't prove anything. But it seems to me that Ken Lay probably was on a beach somewhere. Maybe Epstein Island, actually, now that I think about it. And lived out the rest of his days living under the radar, because he made a lot of people a lot of money that knew what was in on the game, and leaving the taxpayer and the pension holder and the government and everybody else holding the bag. That's okay to those guys. They don't care. They got their payday, because he could have ratted them out. He could have. He took the fall. Another one. It's also a conspiracy theory. Eli Spitzer. Okay, Eli Spitzer was the governor of New York, and he was busted dead to rights with prostitutes. Okay, but this ties into a larger issue that actually it's not really about Eli Spitzer. It's just that it underscored that this was happening, and he was subject to blackmail. I don't know if he was blackmailed or not. I'd have to look a little further into that. But he was definitely doing stuff, and it involved a prostitution ring. There was a prostitution ring run by what was colloquially called the DC Madam. I can't remember her name right offhand. Baffrey or something like that. Anyway, it was back in like 2002 or something. So this woman, who I do believe actually facilitated services for Eli Spitzer, was running a prostitution ring, and people were getting busted using this prostitution ring. It was a brothel. It was a high-end brothel in the heart of DC. So she was getting the book thrown at her, and she said, you know what? I have some powerful friends, and I think my powerful friends ought to step up now and help exonerate me. So, of course, nobody's real quick to run to that. But she says, I have a little black book. I have a little black book with a lot of names in it. And then she starts at the bottom in terms of her rank of importance and says, Congressman so-and-so has spent time in my luxury salon or whatever it is, where nothing illegal takes place. Ask him he'll tell you how above board my establishment is. So, of course, the media turns on him, and they're like, have you done anything fun with the DC madam? Tell us all about it, right? So he, of course, immediately is like, no, everything was great. And also, I have to quit Congress, and I have to go spend time with my family, right? As they do. They always have to spend time with their family, right? Explaining to your wife, yeah, I was using the high-end hooker service. But I was, I didn't inhale, or whatever lame excuse you got to come up with now, my friend. But anyway, so she's like, great. I'm so glad he came forward to talk about how innocent my services are. So I'm looking forward to talking to multiple other witnesses until I become a free woman. Also, she says, I will note to you all, I will not kill myself. I am not suicidal. I love living. I want my freedom. I can't wait to be free, right? Now, I'm being a little glib about it, but she was backed against the corner and she did not want to get in trouble. She didn't want to go to jail for this. Not when she was helping all these wealthy, powerful people. She thought she was being protected by her status. She had the illusion of that protection and was expecting people to follow through on it because she had information on them. That is blackmail, but it's blackmail, understandable blackmail that I think anyone would use if they were committing crimes. You know what I mean? Don't commit the crimes, of course. That is bad. But it's game theory, simple strategy in that regard. Of course, she shows up dead a week later. And they're like, oh, we all expected that. The media is just like, yep, she was suicidal. She was going to go to jail. And no other congressman got named. And everybody looked the other way on that one, too. So this stuff, if you actually use your brain and put basic theory together about actions and words and come up with a story and think to yourself, chances are she was running a brothel in DC for wealthy, powerful men who were away from their homes and are masters of the universe and would like to experience something they otherwise wouldn't experience because they would not be able to do it on just the raw merits. They could come here and have a good time with the ladies, and I can be protected from that, even though it's a highly illegal service, because they're powerful people who run the show. And then when she got busted, no one was willing to come help her because they didn't want to deal with the aftermath of standing up for her and saying, no, I've used her service and it's totally cool. You go there and you get your dinner with the grapes dropped in your mouth or whatever, but nothing illicit happens. No one was willing to do that for her, so she was going to go to jail. And I could go on and on and on and on and on and on about these stories that don't add up, that the government tells us. Various people who ended their own lives by shooting themselves twice in the back of the head, those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, it undermines trust in government. And the more aggressive they are about denying this stuff, the more, for me at least, it makes me question, what are they trying to hide? Now, I think that's a terrible posture to take. Your denial is an admission of guilt. But at the same time, you got to follow the pattern of behavior. And this is another big one. This is the biggest one I think that we have. I can't think of any other scandal in American history that at least has been unearthed that comes anywhere close to this. We have a whole network of high-powered individuals in and out of government, making decisions, writing laws, signing things into law, and running giant companies that are part of our retirement funds and all that other stuff, all engaged in criminal sexual behavior that is unethical even when they're consenting adults, but it's still consenting adults when it's that, like the DC Madam was. But these are children that we're talking about. And you start going down this rabbit hole and it just gets worse and worse. I don't know where the bottom is on this thing. Now, when I was looking into this stuff back when it was still a conspiracy theory that you were a wackadoo to even consider as a possibility, there was some very, very dark stuff that they were talking about. Now, I've never seen any true pictures of anything truly wild, but I've heard people talking about because I can't take it. In the same way that the guy who got beheaded in Iraq, the video that was out there, there was no way I was going to watch that. I trust that it was horrible and vicious and all that other stuff. I can't stomach that. Well, I do know what happened, and reading people talking about what they're seeing and what they're talking about, and there's so many of them talking about it in this way, and they're piecing together this behavior in such a way that it started, at least some of it seemed credible. And that's the issue, is that there are conspiracy theories that are fun to play with. You know, ancient civilizations and artifacts were found in Antarctica by the Nazis, and that's where we got transistors. I like that one. That one's fun, right? Probably not true. Fun to entertain your mind. Or Atlantis, they discovered Atlantis there, or something. This is not one of those, though. This is one more like the JFK assassination, where the government has been, and other powerful people have been trying to throw people off the scent of this very obvious thing that's been going on for many years, and harming the messengers and squelching the messengers and slandering and libeling the messengers who are simply saying, something doesn't smell right here. I was shocked when they said that Jeffrey Epstein was arrested. I couldn't believe it. They're actually doing something about this guy. I was not shocked when he mysteriously killed himself. I will not be shocked if he turns out to be alive. Now, I happen to have a friend of mine who has a very interesting network of people who says something very different. And I'm inclined to believe him quite a bit too, that Jeffrey Epstein is indeed dead. Just maybe not by self-inflicted means. But who knows what the truth is, because the government isn't going to tell us. Even if they tell us the absolute truth, whatever it happens to be, I don't know if I believe them. That's the situation now, because they've been lying to us so much for so long. And it's true of all sorts of things. I joke that if the media tells me that the sky is blue, I go outside and look. Is it really blue? Or are they full of it? I thought it was blue, but now I'm doubting my own sanity. They've got us wrapped around the axle in terms of our information. We don't know what's true anymore. Even basic situations where someone gets shot in the street and there's video of it, you get two very different stories that tell very different tales about what happened there as you watch with your own eyes. And the media is very good at doing stuff like you see two men talking and you don't hear a word they're saying because there's a talking head in front of you that's telling you what they say. They're constantly framing the message for us. And I hope to God that finally, someone looks at this with seriousness, because they dump these files out and they are protecting the names of the people who actually are performing these acts and these crimes, and not thinking about the most basic ethical thing. These are children we're talking about. And if you aren't willing to protect children from something like this because you're afraid of rocking the boat or making your life a little worse because you're investments may turn sideways, or the funding may dry up for your next reelection campaign, or maybe something bad might happen to you and your family if you go after these people. If you aren't willing to stand up, who is? I can't do anything. I'm sitting here with a very, what they call, black pill view. Nothing's going to happen here. No matter how much we know about these people, nothing's going to happen because no one has the wherewithal, the fortitude to see this through despite whatever threat they think is going to happen to them. And indeed, I believe the threats are real. I think a lot of times the threat is, if I'm going down, you're going down with me because I have video with you too. If a majority of these people are involved, or rather if a majority of our government is involved in some way in this stuff, enough to have a blackmail conversation, either they're themselves or their family members or whatever, enough to get them paused to actually do this, to do anything about it, nothing is going to happen. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that's what Jeffrey Epstein was doing, is he was setting up a trap so that if anyone falls, everyone falls. So that whoever is pulling the strings can get what they want accomplished. And I think that's the end game, is find out who's pulling the strings behind Jeffrey Epstein. We may not like that answer either. That'll be the next conspiracy theory that you're crazy about, until all the evidence starts to make you think maybe it's true. And then more evidence comes out, and now you can't deny that it's looking more and more like who I think